let's deal with the punchline first. China doesn't survive the decade as an industrial power, probably not even as a unified country. The demographic situation now there is so bad that, and the aging is happening so quickly, and the birth rate dropped so low so long ago that by 2050, the population of China will be less than half of what it is today. And we're already in a situation well, remember, Germany has more in their 60s and their 50s and their 40s and so on. Their demographic does this towards the children. China's does this. Their point of no return was 30 years ago. This is not a recent thing. Combination of the fastest urbanization humanity has ever experienced with the one-child policy at the same time, that was national suicide, and now they're dying. They no longer have a workforce that is competitive in any manufacturing sector. Also, there's not a product made in China that can't be made cheaper elsewhere. And the only reason we still think of China as a manufacturing power at all is because of the pre-existing sunk costs of the industrial plant, but the COVID lockdowns are even removing that from the table. So there's no reason to expect China to ever get better. Also, their energy comes from a continent away, except for the part that comes from 2 continents away. Also, all of the inputs that they need for their food, with the exception of phosphate fertilizer, they're all imported. So anything happens to globalization for any reason, and this is a country that just ceases to exist. There is no way with deglobalization that China emerges from this decade with more than 700 million people. It's going to be that bad and that catastrophic. So the Russian demographic is awful. It will lead to a dissolution of the Russian state this century, probably around mid-century, if I was a betting man. But it's not so rapid because Russia, when it urbanized, it only urbanized in part, and when it industrialized, it only industrialized in part. So until you get to the post-Soviet collapse, the demographics really, they were ugly by many measures, but they weren't terminal. And there are some strategic things that the Russians can do to buy themselves more time. The Ukraine war is part of that. They're trying to get to a more defensible outer shell where they can put static forces in a few geographic areas that will block forces from coming into their space in the future. So I don't mean to suggest that the Russian situation is pretty. It is still terminal. But there are some things that you can do with strategic policy that buy more time. China doesn't have that option. Russia is an exporter of food and energy. China is an importer. Russia can plug its periphery. China's periphery is naval. There is no country or combination of countries that the Chinese can invade and conquer in order to solve any of their problems, where there's a nice list for the Russians. So the most likely outcome here is that China just kind of implodes into itself. Does that mean there can't be a war? Of course not. When countries are dying, you never know what they're going to do. The issue of the moment, of course, seems to be Taiwan. But the Chinese government now knows that if they make a move on Taiwan, it's A, going to be harder than they thought. B, they know there are going to be international sanctions. And C, they know there are going to be international boycotts. And any one of those is enough to destroy the Chinese system, much less all 3 at once. The Chinese have always thought of Russia as their dumb neighbor, and you let the dumb neighbor try things. They're the canary in the coal mine, if you will. And they now know that everything they've prepared for the last 40 years was based on faulty assumptions. This is normally the place where you would, as a national leader, send all of your smart people into another room to kind of game out some replacement plannings. But the cult of personality in China is now so tight, and Xi has executed so many people at the top that he no longer has a brain trust to send into the other room. So China's just slamming its head into the wall over and over and over and over until something cracks. And I don't think that something is going to be Taiwan. The labor crunch situation in East Asia is far worse than it is in the United States. Because while we have millennials, they don't. And they also have something called the one-child policy, which has been gutting the Chinese demographic for 40 years now. And China is now the fastest collapsing demographic in human history. And there is no way the PRC survives the next decade in its current form. They just don't have the tax structure and the labor structure to even try. So this was always going to fail this decade. COVID may be speeding things up a little bit. And the end of China as kind of a major centerweight in the East Asian geopolitical structure, that is something that is going to reverberate for decades to come. Now, from the American point of view, this is all a net gain. From the Japanese point of view, this is all a net gain. But for some of the countries that were trying to have their foot in both worlds, have their cake and eat it too, this is a bit of a disaster. So if you are Korea or say Thailand or maybe even India, where you've tried to balance your security needs with the United States, your economic needs with the Chinese, you're about to lose both because the Americans are no longer interested in patrolling the world and they're resourcing their entire manufacturing system. That doesn't leave a lot else for anyone else. So demographically, they're in collapse. There's no way we can rework that. The Chinese are releasing bits of their 2020 census now, and they're grudgingly admitting that they overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million, all of whom would have been born since one child, and most of whom would have been women. So even with like some low-level cloning, China's not going to survive this decade. They don't even have the numbers to try. Second, the Chinese have a lot of ships, but most are very small, and almost all of them can't sail more than 1,000 miles from port, and only that if they're moving slow and not dodging and no one's shooting at them. So the Chinese don't have the naval capacity to go out and secure markets or resources. They are entirely dependent on the U.S. Navy to do that for them. And to think that a core tenet of the U.S. national policy in this era is to bleed and die so that the Chinese can import raw materials and export finished goods, that strikes me as a stretch. Third, they've lost their government. I think one of the biggest problems they're having right now is the chairman himself, Xi Jinping. He's enacted a cult of personality that is tighter than anything that has ever existed through Chinese history, and it's gotten so tight that no one wants to bring him information about anything, and no one wants to do anything if they think it's going to clash with what he wants. So we have this policy paralysis throughout the entire Chinese system. They are now incapable of changing. I think the best example I can give you is that in Shanghai, they are now literally disinfecting runways at the airport because of COVID fears. There's just no functional policy coming down from the top, because when you only have one dude, can you imagine if you're in a Fortune 500 company and the CEO had to direct every specific thing, him or herself? Now, do that for a country of 1.4 billion people, 1.3 billion people. Everything is seizing up. They're not making progress on transport. They're not making transport in the information or the digital economy. They're bringing down their own stock market because they've turned everything into cult of personality economics. This is how countries die. But Xi has really done everything he could to purge the system of all potential rivals. And that has included intimidating into silence or imprisoning anyone who is capable of independent thought within the bureaucratic system. So you never want to rule out something like a coup. It could happen, but if that did happen, it's difficult to see whoever would pull it off to be able then to control the country on the other side of it. They might be a regional leader and they might be fine for their region, but the rest of the Chinese system would have a different opinion on who should be in charge. That's how civil wars begin. So I don't think that's a great thing to put your hopes into if you're hoping for China to remain part of the international system. I don't think the Chinese are anticipating a conflict. I mean, the U.S. certainly doesn't have an interest in a war in the Western Pacific right now. And when the Chinese look at what's happening in Russia with Ukraine, they realize that every bit of their plans for Taiwan have proven incorrect. The international community did not just accept the deal. The war was not over in a week. And the concept of boycotts, that individual consumers could actually shape corporate policy, wow, the Chinese have no frame of reference for that at all. So I think actually the risk of a war of China trying to take over Taiwan has dropped. The sanctions proofing, that makes a lot more sense. The Chinese are discovering that sanctions really can hurt a major country that happens to be a food and oil exporter. Can you imagine the damage for China, which is a food and oil importer? They're concerned that if these sanctions were put against China for whatever reason, that would be the end of China within a year. And they're right. There's only two things you can do in that circumstance: stockpile so you can buy more time, or fundamentally change your foreign security output so that sanctions don't happen because you are no longer perceived as hostile. And because the Chinese no longer can adapt their policy, because there's only one guy making all the decisions, trying to sanction proof is all you can do. It won't work. China imports 85% of its energy and 85% of the inputs to grow its food. So the most they can do is buy a few weeks, but what their system is, as it is right now, that's the best case outcome. The Chinese are a great example of how it all doesn't work. The land quality is poor. There are barriers internally that separate various chunks of their populations from one another. So if you're in southern China or central China, you have a very different idea of what China is compared to someone who's from Beijing.
Mm.
And there are some buffers, but most of the buffers work against you instead of for you. The Chinese have the first island chain off their shore, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, and so on, that have always been hostile to mainland China and have always inhibited mainland China's ability to interface with the rest of the world. About the only reason that the Chinese system even exists right now is because at the end of the World War II, the Americans changed the way the world worked, and we told countries they could no longer have colonies. And the Japanese went home, and the Europeans went home, and for the first time in Chinese history, there was no foreign power gunning for them.
Mm.
And they made hay out of that, a lot of hay.